So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here today. And I'm going to talk about my experience both as someone with psoriasis and a psychologist. But before I start, I'd like to make a couple of disclaimers. So I am a clinical psychologist and I specialise in working with people with health conditions. But that's not to say that I get it right with psoriasis. So I absolutely have times when I feel overwhelmed and fed up, and that's absolutely normal. But the techniques and strategies that I've learned and that I know help me to cope on those difficult days, and they also mean that I have more good days than bad days. So that's the first disclaimer. And the second one is that I may cry during this presentation, so I'm going to try my very hardest not to cry. But if I do that, that's okay, because emotions are powerful, but they're absolutely not dangerous. So if I cry, we'll get through it. You don't need to look worried. So that's me in the middle there. I can feel myself going already. This could be a long half hour. I'm between my dad and my elder sister, and happy in my own skin there. But it wasn't long after that I started to develop psoriasis. And by the time I was a teenager, I had quite extensive and poorly managed psoriasis right through my teen years. And really, from the very start, one of the things that I found hardest to cope with was the attention of other people. So those of you with psoriasis will know exactly what that's like. You get all sorts of attention. You get staring, which may or may not be at you. You get comments, often intended kindly, like, oh, that looks sore. You know, always something bitten you. You get questions. When I was a child, usually directed to my mum or dad, you know, what's wrong with her? Why can't you clear it up? There's the teasing, which oftentimes is intended to be good-natured, but often doesn't feel that way. And there is times when you experience bullying. So for me, I remember once being in our local pub in a skirt and a young man pushing his finger into my leg to make his friends shriek with horror. Oh, not very nice. So it's not surprising that I started to feel quite ashamed of the way I looked. And I'm not alone in that. So lots of people are looking at me sympathetically now, but that's going to start me crying. But it's common in people with psoriasis. We feel a lot of shame because of our experiences of unwanted attention, which happens a lot during adolescence. Now, shame is a moral emotion, so we call it a moral emotion. It's like guilt or embarrassment. But whereas guilt is an embarrassment is I have done something wrong, in shame, it's I am wrong, I am flawed. So it's a painful emotion. So it's associated with negative self-evaluations. And it's not linked to psoriasis severity. So you can't look at someone and see how severe their psoriasis is to guess how much shame they're experiencing. But what we do know is the longer you've had psoriasis, then the more shame you feel. So shame doesn't develop just because of the unwanted attention. There's lots of different reasons why we start to feel shame. We start to have quite a self-critical inner voice that tells us, you know, that we don't look very good. We start to be fearful that people will judge us. For those of us who have psoriatic arthritis, that might make doing daily tasks tricky, and we may feel shame about having to ask for help or not being able to do the things that are important to us. And of course, there's societal beliefs. So in our society, a healthy, glowing skin is prized. And there's an assumption that somebody with glowing skin is sleeping well, eating well, exercising well, managing their stress. And then those of us who don't have perfect skin are doing some or maybe even all of these things wrong. Obviously, it's a myth, but it's a strong one. So this psoriasis compass of shame, I've adapted the compass of shame, which is a shame researcher from the 90s looking at shame in the general population, and people tend to respond to shame in one or a combination of these ways. So they hide from others, or they hide from themselves, or they attack the self with criticism, or they respond with anger and defensiveness. And there's been quite a bit of research, and you do see that when people are prone to shame, people who have psoriasis, people who don't have psoriasis, they tend to react in one of these four ways as a way of trying to cope or manage that difficult, painful emotion. And in psoriasis, what we see is people start to conceal their skin, conceal their feelings, avoid activities, isolate themselves from people. It affects what they do during their day, their daily activities. It even affects the educational grades that someone gets, so their future. We see that people often feel angry and respond with anger to lots of situations, and people are more likely to use substances as a way of distracting themselves from these painful feelings. And people who experience shame are much more likely to have an increase in stress hormones, so they quickly go into a fight or flight response. And we know that that's related to inflammation in the body, so may in fact be contributing to the whole issue. So for me, what did that mean? Well, I became the master of hiding and concealment. So light clothes, long sleeves, tights, makeup that would hide my skin. If you asked me how I was doing, I would tell you I was fine. Even took mirrors down so I didn't have to look at myself. And then alongside that, pursued any miracle cure that I came across, like anything. I tried anything and everything. And I think I would have said I was doing fine. I was coping. You know, I was getting on with life. I obviously had lots of good things in my life too. But actually, I was missing out, so there's lots I wasn't doing, and I would get an enormous amount of anxiety if I had to do something where I would feel exposed, you know, like swimming lessons at school or things like that. And of course, none of the miracle cures have worked, and then I'd be left with a sense of blame and failure. You know, what have I done wrong? Why isn't it working for me? And I became quite self-critical. But overall, what this meant was that I didn't know how I was feeling. My friends and family didn't know. My dermatologist didn't know. So I didn't feel understood, and I didn't get the support I needed. I don't know if this is sounding familiar to people with psoriasis. I've seen lots of nods. Yeah, just as well I'm not crying, you'd all be with me. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I work with people with health conditions. So I've spent my career thinking about the impact of health on someone's psychological well-being. And so I think of psoriasis, the impacts of psoriasis, as being a bit like an iceberg. So above the water, we have the things that everybody can see, that the plaques, the scales and flakes, and the signs like our hospital appointments or walking aids. But below the water is a lot of emotional impacts that people don't necessarily see, and oftentimes we're not even aware of either. Things like depression, anxiety, feeling self-blame, the burden of treatments, sleep problems, isolation and withdrawal, and so on. So it's possible to have psoriasis and not experience any of those, but if you're like me, then you will have experienced some of them at some point. But as a psychologist, I have great confidence in the power of psychological therapies to help with these things. So I know that there are things that can help, and I want to spend a little bit of time today talking to you about them. And I like to think of it as a toolbox. So it's not just one thing that you can do, like do this one thing and you'll feel better. It's actually a lot of different techniques and strategies that may be helpful for different people at different times. So obviously that looks like quite a busy slide, and I'm not going to have time to go through all that today, but I want to focus just on two of those, and in particular, a psychological therapy, which hasn't worked, unfortunately. It was supposed to do a really clever zoom in, but it didn't. A psychological therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. So this is based on the idea that we all have an internal conversation going on inside our heads all the time. So while you're listening to me, you're having a little commentary and conversation in your head that you're not really paying attention to. It could be about what I'm saying. It could be about something completely different, like what you're going to cook for dinner tonight. And that's normal, and that's what most of us have. But what happens when you have something like psoriasis is that thoughts are often about psoriasis, and you can tune into what I call radio psoriasis, where the thoughts are quite negative and gloomy, and they take all your focus, and you spend all your time in front of the radio, tuned into radio psoriasis. And then the other things in life you're not aware of or not paying attention to. And that may seem complicated, but I'll explain it with a few more slides. So in acceptance and commitment therapy, or what we call as ACT, there's 4 basic principles. So it's this idea of diffusing or stepping back from your internal conversation or your internal monologue that just runs in the background. So just being able to let it play. For making room for painful feelings and difficult thoughts. And the basic idea is that it's part of being human that we will have these difficult thoughts and they will come up. So it's almost making space for them, which sounds complex, but it's pretty straightforward. And the other principle is that you need to make contact with the present moment. So turn your attention to what's happening right now in the room, rather than focusing all your attention on your thinking and how awful things are. And then the final thing is really thinking about what matters to you, what you value, who you want to be, and doing those things in spite of all the thoughts and painful feelings. So I hope that makes sense. So just imagine you're a bus driver. So you have a bus and there's a destination you want to go to. And so the destination is having good relationships, having intimate relationships, and that's really important to you. But on your bus are some really difficult passengers. They're really unpleasant. They're moaning on at you. They're telling you, don't go that way. No one's going to like you. You're never going to have a relationship. You'll always be single. And they're really unpleasant, moany, loud passengers. So for a while you argue with them. You say, that's not true, that's not true. And you try and take your bus in that direction. They're going on and on. So in the end you say, okay, I'm going to drive the bus another way, and then you'll quieten down. And they do quieten down a little bit. But the thing is now you're driving your bus away from what's important to you. So you put the handbrake on. You say, get off my bus, but they won't go. They just stay on your bus, they don't go. Just get off the bus. Now you're feeling despairing and you're not going anywhere at all. So that's a bit like what psoriasis is like, and the passengers are your difficult thoughts and feelings. And for these 2 bus drivers, they're letting their thoughts hook them and they're becoming fused with them. So what you do in acceptance and commitment therapy is you're aware that the passengers are on your bus, they're unpleasant, they're intimidating, but they don't physically hurt you and they don't take control of the steering wheel. They don't do those things. So instead, in acceptance and commitment therapy, you think, well, actually what's important to me is developing strong relationships, is having good friendships. So I will do those things that make that happen, and I will just let the passengers come with me for the ride. So I'm not ignoring them. I haven't got my fingers in my ears. You know, I'm not drowning them out by self-medicating with alcohol or whatever. I'm just noticing they're there, I'm letting them be, and I'm living my life in the direction that's important to me. And we call that diffusion. So I hope I haven't lost you so far. But the next bit is contact with the present moment, and in acceptance and commitment therapy, we use mindfulness. Have people tried mindfulness? So mindfulness is really simple. It's just bringing your attention to the present in a particular way and non-judgmentally. So you're not evaluating things as good or bad or true or false. You're just noticing the things around you. You might be noticing the temperature or the sounds or, for example, before this, I noticed I was feeling nervous about this presentation. So I focused my attention on the chair and my feet on the floor. And though my mind pulls me back to, oh, it's going to be dreadful, you're going to cry, you know, everyone's going to be shocked, all that kind of thing, I noticed that was happening. My passengers were getting unruly, and I just said, well, thanks for that, but I'm focusing my attention on the here and now. So you just observe things as they arise. So this is my son, Dylan. He's just about to graduate from university, so he's quite a bit bigger than that now. But I love this photo because children are very good at being mindful about being in the present. So this is Dylan's thought bubble. He's in the sunshine with his mum. He's having a lovely chocolate ice cream. It's all over his face, but it's sweet, it's cold, it's delicious. He's focusing on the present. The other thought bubble is what's going on in my head. So I'm in the park with my lovely son on a sunny day, but my head is somewhere else. I'm thinking about things that happened at work yesterday. I'm thinking Oh, he's not going to eat his dinner. I'm looking at his T-shirt, I'm thinking, am I going to get those stains out? What about the wasps? All the while, I'm missing the moment. And while I'm thinking these things, my body is reacting as if my thoughts are the truth. So if I'm replaying something that happened at work yesterday that was stressful, I will respond as if I'm in a stressful situation. So my heart will beat fast, my breathing will speed up, my blood pressure will change, my body will produce cortisol and adrenaline. But actually, I'm in the park on a sunny day, safe, with my son. So if I was being mindful, I would just return that would happen to me because that's what happens to humans. Our brains are busy and we can't stop them doing it. But I would just notice it had happened and I would just come back to focusing on Dylan. So there's lots of good evidence that mindfulness is really beneficial. And in psoriasis, there was a study where they split a group of people having phototherapy into two groups. One group normal phototherapy and one group phototherapy and listening to mindfulness. And the group who had the mindfulness with the phototherapy cleared up faster. So it has benefits for us, but it has benefits for everyone, not least that you don't miss the moment worrying about the past or fretting about the future. And there's excellent evidence for acceptance and commitment therapy, helping people manage depression and anxiety. And there's some studies coming out now looking at acceptance and commitment therapy in psoriasis. And the evidence is looking that people are feeling better about themselves when they learn these pretty simple, straightforward strategies and techniques. So the other tool in my toolbox is connection with others. So why is connection with other people important, people with psoriasis? It is because you get peer support and understanding that you can't get from people who don't know what you're living through. Tips and advice are practical and useful, and people have tried things and tested things. But I think most powerfully is you don't feel so alone when you know other people have experienced the same struggle as you. And the other thing it helps with is empathy and compassion. Because if one of my best friends has psoriasis, and when I look at her, I never think she looks contagious or disgusting. And then, so how does it make sense that I say that to myself? But I would never say it about her. So there's something about developing empathy and compassion for others with psoriasis that helps you develop the same empathy and compassion for yourself. And that helps reduce those painful feelings of shame. And there's good evidence that peer connection improves quality of life, but also improves psoriasis severity. So there's some evidence that skin improves from connection with other people. So some of you may be aware of Brené Brown. She's a researcher in shame. She's a shame researcher, and she has the most excellent TED talk about shame, which I would encourage you to listen to if you haven't. And she says, empathy is the antidote to shame. If you put shame in a Petri dish, it needs 3 things to grow exponentially: secrecy, silence, and judgment. If you put the same amount in a Petri dish and douse it with empathy, it can't survive. The 2 most powerful words when we're in struggle is me too. So I think a big tick for all of us for being here today and connecting with each other through the Psoriasis Association. And finally, well, my story's ongoing. Self-disclosure is not easy for me. If you'd said to me even 5 years ago that I would be here talking about my psoriasis, I would not have believed you. But here I am with a photo too. So I encourage the patients that I work with to tell the people they love what's going on for them. And I have never done that. I've always said I'm fine. So I am doing my best to practice what I preach and sharing and communicating what's going on for me. I'm also working hard on practicing self-compassion, so that when I look at myself and have a negative, critical thought, I think to myself, what would I say to someone I love? And I would use that for myself. So that's a daily thing. I work hard on that. And I'm also working on radical self-acceptance, which is not complacency. It's not saying, that's it, I don't want to get rid of my psoriasis, but it's saying, here and right now, I accept myself for who I am. So I'm connecting with others with psoriasis. I'm here today. I'm trying to do more on social media, and I want to promote more psoriasis awareness, especially around the psychological and mental health implications of psoriasis. And I've been fortunate enough to be part of a series of books by clinical psychologists with lived experience. And I've written this book, Coping with Psoriasis, which is due out at the beginning of July. The QR code will take you to the publishers, and there's a 20% discount code if you wanted, the publishers are Sequoia, if you wanted to buy a copy. But I talk about acceptance and commitment therapy, but I also talk about lots of other psychological strategies, so all the ones that you saw on that big toolbox. So diolch yn fawr, and I'm happy to take questions if there's time. And I'm delighted I didn't cry.
Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. It was interesting to hear about your experience. I've had psoriasis for 41 years, since I was 7, and I was looked after by the NHS in a children's hospital. I was actually an inpatient for 7 weeks when I was 8 years old. And when I sort of graduated from there at 16, I just accepted, you know, I've got psoriasis for the rest of my life. About 3 years ago, I read Pete Walker's book about complex PTSD and sort of recognised myself in that. And then I read on the PTSD UK's website in 2022 about the link between chronic skin conditions, including psoriasis and PTSD. So I found a chartered clinical psychologist and started to work with her, and our work included the ACT therapy and also the EMDR work, sort of reprocessing emotions, and also a bit of hypnotherapy. And it's a bizarre experience, sort of having had this condition for 40 years, that my psoriasis is starting to disappear. So I can understand the mental health effects of having psoriasis, but I now actually, from my own experience, start to see psoriasis as a symptom of something else.
Yes, that's really interesting, thank you. And I'm really pleased to hear that for you, yeah. It's powerful, isn't it, acceptance and commitment therapy? Yeah.
Hi, I also want to say thank you for that, and for not crying, because you nearly made me cry. And I think a lot of people in the room will relate to all of that. I've also had it a long time, and I've been reading something about the links between, or possible links between, early childhood trauma and psoriasis, and I wondered if you knew anything further about that.
So there's a lot of research into adverse childhood events. Is that what you're referring to? Or they call them ACEs. And the research does say that if you have a certain number of it, so ACEs are things like witnessing violence or experiencing abuse, or not having enough food to eat, and that kind of thing. There's like a list of them, and the evidence is that if you get to a certain number of traumas in your life, so a cumulative amount of traumas, and that predisposes you then to develop lots of conditions, cancers, heart conditions, and I believe that there's some evidence for psoriasis as part of that too. So I think it's around 7 ACEs. If you've got 7 ACEs in your childhood history, then you are more likely to develop autoimmune conditions like psoriasis. Yeah. There's also an excellent TED talk on adverse childhood events, if anyone's interested in learning more about that.
I have time for one more question, if there is one. Can't wait. If not, Catherine, thank you so much for